Good evening, everybody. It's really wonderful to be with you here this evening, and both to see a lot of familiar faces from Tuesday nights, which is when I'm typically here, as well as those of you who I don't know as well. Lovely to be with you. So I want to open my talk by telling you a little bit more about me and how I got interested in the things that I study and the connection to mindfulness and the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. So immediately after I graduated from college in 2008, I went to live in Egypt, live and work in Egypt for a year. And during that time, one of my sort of favorite activities that my friends and I liked to do was we would stay up essentially all night. I like to tell people if you're meeting an Egyptian to hang out, then 11 p.m. is early. We would hang out all night, sitting in a cafe, drinking tea and smoking hookah and talking politics, because many other my Egyptian friends just really loved talking politics. And at the time, Egypt was ruled by a man named Hosni Mubarak. He had been president for about 30 years. And the only really relevant political question in Egypt at the time was when Hosni Mubarak dies, because he's definitely going to be president until he dies. When he dies, is it his son who's going to be the next president, or is it the head of the secret police who's going to be the next president? But much to everyone's surprise, just a couple of years later, shortly after I left Egypt, Egypt experienced a revolution. In the winter of 2011, from January until February, millions of Egyptians from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, gathered in major city squares around their country and demanded social change. And after just a period of 3 weeks of protests, strikes, boycotts, and other forms of nonviolent resistance. Or do I need to angle myself a little closer to the mic?
I can't hear you as much in the back.
Okay. All right. Let's see. How's that? Better? Okay. Let me just. There we go. Thanks. And so after just 3 weeks of protests, President Mubarak stepped down from power, and a period of political transition started in Egypt. And I had a lot of friends who were, who were activists, who were interested in politics, and this had been just as surprising to them as it had been to everyone else, and certainly to me. And so I really wanted to understand how something like this happens. How you get from, a time just shortly before where no one had any hope that any real political change would be possible in Egypt, to a time where after just a few weeks, everything changed in this country. And so I've had the great good fortune to be able to go to graduate school, to study under one of the world's leading scholars of nonviolent resistance, to try and better understand these kinds of questions. And at a similar time in my life, I was at a family member's house over the holidays, and made the classic mistake of not bringing enough reading material with me, and was just sort of casually perusing their bookshelf, and came across The Miracle of Mindfulness, which was the first book by Thich Nhat Hanh that I had ever read. And reading that book just sort of fundamentally changed my perspective on life and and how I approached my daily living, and was the start of my regular meditation practice, and ultimately what brought me here. And one part of my journey that I have really appreciated over the more than a decade now since these things took place is learning the links between these two passions. Of course, one of the great contributions of Thich Nhat Hanh that many of you may be familiar with is the modern articulation of the idea of engaged Buddhism. This concept that dedication to the alleviation of suffering of other beings involves not just personal practice, but also collective action to deal with structures of oppression and injustice. When I was preparing for this talk, one of the places I was looking at was the website of the Order of Interbeing, and I was heartened to see, even just on the front page, there's a long post there about how sitting down is revolutionary, highlighting both the sitting that we do in the meditation hall and the sit-ins of the civil rights movement. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, engaged Buddhism is just Buddhism. When bombs begin to fall on people, you cannot stay in the meditation hall all the time. Meditation is about the awareness of what is going on, not only in your body and in your feelings, but all around you. Thich Nhat Hanh also, of course, articulated the 14 principles of engaged Buddhism, many of which speak to this issue. And in particular, I was struck by Principle 9 and Principle 10. In Principle 9, calls us to have the courage to speak out about situations of injustice, even when doing so may threaten your safety. And Principle 10, which ends by saying that a religious community should take a clear stand against oppression and injustice and should strive to change that situation. So in sort of the tradition of engaged Buddhism, we have a strong moral or ethical imperative to use our mindfulness practice not just to relieve our own suffering, but to relieve the suffering of other beings. But as I mentioned in the introductory text to my talk, often I think when we think about social injustice, when we think about structures of oppression or inequality, that task can seem very far away from any one of us and very distant and often very hopeless. How can you and I, just as individuals in our own sort of small way, strive to change the sources of injustice that seem so far beyond us? And so what I want to talk about this evening is illustrating some practical lessons that blend insights from Thich Nhat Hanh on the principle of interbeing with academic research, some of it my own, on nonviolent resistance, less on the sense of nonviolence as a moral imperative, and more about those practical questions. More about not just, do I feel like I must do something because I am compelled to by my morality, but also, how can I have specific hope that my action can make a difference, that nonviolent resistance can actually achieve change. And there are 3 specific lessons that I want to highlight about that. But before that, I want to briefly define my terms, like a good academic should. So first, on interbeing. I think for many people in this room, this is likely a very familiar concept. But I think the core of interbeing is this core principle that everything relies on everything else. That we as human beings cannot exist without our connections with all other things. Nothing can exist without everything else in the universe. As Thich Nhat Hanh says in The Art of Living, we inter-are with one another and with all life. The whole planet is one giant living, breathing cell with all its working parts linked in symbiosis. So that's interbeing. What about nonviolent resistance? And again, I think many of you may have images that come to mind, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or others. What I mean by nonviolent resistance, and I'll talk through this definition a bit more. Nonviolent resistance is a technique of political struggle that involves shifting power in a conflict without the use of physical violence. Typical methods of nonviolent resistance include things like protest, strikes, and boycotts, but this is a much larger realm of action that isn't limited to any one of those particular tactics. And I will say a bit more about that in a second. So what are the connections between these things, and how can those connections inspire greater hope in us to achieve social change? Well, again, I like to do this in my lectures with my students. I have 3 lessons. They're all tied with alliteration as well to help them be memorable. So Interbeing teaches us that change through nonviolent resistance is possible, the lesson of possibility. There's a lesson of practice. Interbeing informs how we can practice nonviolent resistance. And finally, a lesson of perseverance. That Interbeing shows us the way that change through nonviolent resistance can persevere over time. So first, on the question of possibility. So I think while we often think of the principle of interbeing in biological terms, it's often illustrated, Thich Nhat Hanh famously illustrates this through describing all of the many different things that go into the creation of a single flower. The creation of a single flower involves sort of all of these complex chemical and biological processes that link the flower to everything else. But what I want to highlight this evening is that just as physical and biological structures inter-are, so social and political structures inter-are. That a political structure like a city, a country, or even the international system of states, its existence depends in subtle ways on the existence of all of the individuals that constitute it. And this simple insight is core to how scholars have thought about the logic of nonviolent action. That nonviolent action works, achieves its power and its force because of the social nature of power. That while we often think of power in social or political systems as something that an individual holds, that an individual can use to compel others, that can perhaps only be destroyed or broken down through violence, this is not how power actually functions. The power that people that we describe as powerful only have that power through the consistent flow of resources, ideology, and other things from the people that exist within the social or political system in which they have power. And scholars refer to this as the pluralistic theory of power. That power is a thing that must be consistently and constantly replenished. That it is constantly dynamic, and that again, in the same way that we can think of the biological processes illustrating the interbeing of physical beings, so this flow of power and resources from people within a political system to leaders within that political system also is something that is deeply related to interconnection and interbeing. All of us in our daily lives, through the things that we do and the things that we don't do, constitute and sustain the systems of power in which we exist. We provide leaders with things like authority, the right to have their orders followed. We provide them with material resources, with human resources, and in some cases we provide them with fear or ideological support. We all participate in systems of power either actively or passively through what we consume, what we advocate for, what we speak up about, and what we choose to remain silent about, how we behave, what we are willing to treat as normal and appropriate, and what we treat as abnormal and inappropriate, how we vote, whether we choose to vote at all, what communities we choose to spend our time on, and what professions we choose to engage in. And the logic of violent revolution ignores all of this. It relies on a view of power that attempts to simply bring force against force in order to destroy. Whereas nonviolent resistance relies on understanding this true nature of power and shifting the relationships that underlie it. It embraces a more expansive understanding of all of the various ways that systems of power come into being. And this better understanding translates to greater effectiveness. There is extensive research out there showing that nonviolent revolutions are more than twice as successful as violent revolutions in achieving transformational political change. And not just in the short term either. that nonviolent resistance is much more effective in preventing outbreaks of violence in the future and in leading to longer-term democratization, something I'll come back to in just a second. And so insight into that strategic logic of nonviolent resistance, resting on social and political interbeing, helps us to remember that change is possible if we are willing to stop providing the kinds of support to existing systems of social and political power that we do in our day-to-day lives. Second, related to practice. The principle of interbeing can help inform us not just that change through nonviolent resistance is possible, but also how to actually go about doing it. The insight of this system of power isn't just that the powerful depend on those that they have power over. It also can help us see the way to resist. If we understand the ways in which our daily practices are supporting or undermining certain kinds of social order, then we can understand better how changes in those practices, particularly when done collectively with others, can target those sources of power in order to lead to change. People often, I think, think of nonviolent resistance as, say, synonymous with protest. That if you're engaged in nonviolent resistance when you go out on the streets and hold up a sign. And protest is an important tactic for sure, but it is a very small subset of the larger repertoire of nonviolent action. Scholars of nonviolent resistance, most prominently Gene Sharp in the 1970s, have articulated hundreds of distinct methods of nonviolent resistance that attempt to target systems of power in different kinds of ways. And effective nonviolent resistance campaigns, this is something that I focused on in my own work and other scholars have as well, are those that don't just engage in a single kind of tactic, like protesting or engaging in strikes or boycotts, but that think carefully and strategically about how their particular social position connects to the sources of power of the system that they are trying to change, and then skillfully leverages that social position in order to undermine those sources of power. And I think the examples of this are manifold. I think for the sake of time, I will keep it brief. And I think this is probably one of my favorite examples of this recently comes from Myanmar and from the mobilization against the military coup there in 2021, where the movement there recognized that the military dictatorship that had been established, one key part of the system of power that kept it in place were ideas about patriarchy and masculine control over women's autonomy. And so women in Myanmar strategically leveraged this particular sort of point of control of the military dictatorship by drawing on a particular gendered idea in Burmese culture around women's clothing, and that there's again a sort of common cultural idea in Myanmar that if a man passes under, sort of walks under a woman's sarong, hanging above him, then this will undermine his masculinity. He will lose his sort of masculine energy by doing this. And so, as a way of sort of expressing their resistance and preventing state violence directed against them, women in Myanmar began stringing clotheslines with sarongs at the front of their protests, so that the soldiers who were facing them would, and you can see sort of, in some cases, very funny images of this. These women are sort of advancing at the front of a protest, unarmed women just holding their garments up, and heavily armed riot police are retreating away from them because they are afraid of losing this one particular source of their power related to these particular ideas about I think so. So one lesson on practice is related to thinking through specific tactics. The second is where this idea of the great chain of nonviolence that I've given as the title for my talk this evening comes from. Sometimes the relationships of social or political interbeing are less direct. This is particularly the case for marginalized identity groups that have been subject to systematic oppression for long periods of time. But interbeing is much more complex than simply relations between two people. That while there may not be a sort of direct relation of social or political interbeing between one oppressed person and the oppressor, that within the larger network of human interconnection, there exist other ways to get from that point A to point B. And so when we think carefully and strategically, not just about how are we directly connected with the oppressor, but how is someone who we are connected to through some relationship of social interbeing connected to an oppressor, then that also can inform the practice of nonviolent resistance. This skillful recognition of interbeing, we can perceive the ways in which all of us ultimately depend on one another, and we can skillfully forge connections that can ultimately undermine oppressive systems of power. The lesson of practice. Finally, and I'll make this brief because I know I've already talked for about 20 minutes, perseverance. Interbeing helps make change through nonviolent resistance persevere. Now, resisting oppression through violence relies on destruction. Nonviolent resistance, on the other hand, is not just about destruction. It is about reshaping that network of social and political relationships of interbeing. It recognizes that as social beings, attempting to end violence and oppression through cutting ourselves off from the oppressor is insufficient. We have to restructure our relationships to change the way power and interdependency flow between us in a more equal way. This is an insight that Mahatma Gandhi in particular emphasized in his writings on nonviolent resistance through his idea of the constructive program. That again, in a struggle against, in his case, colonialism, it was insufficient to simply say, we need to break down the ways in which the British are oppressing us. He said, we need to create an alternative system of social, economic, and political relationships that will fundamentally change the way that we interact with one another. And so, for instance, the sort of very famous tactic of weaving homespun cloth that Mahatma Gandhi emphasized, both directly attacked one of the economic sources of British power over India, and also created new forms of community and interdependence within people who were themselves weaving cloth. Or from our own country, the Montgomery bus boycott, the campaign that that's jump-started the civil rights movement, both undermined an economic source of power from segregated cities in the South, but also created new systems of communalized transportation that helped build the Black community in Montgomery. And what we know from research, including some of my own research, is that nonviolent resistance, again, as I mentioned before, doesn't just achieve change in the short term, but has many of these long-term persevering effects on changing and transforming social and political orders. It's more likely to lead to democracy, and as well, something that I've focused on in my own work, leads to significantly greater inclusion of historically marginalized groups along the lines of ethnicity, gender, or social and economic class. So, to wrap up, 3 lessons related that Interbeing teaches us to give us practical hope about change through nonviolent resistance. That the nature of power also is deeply connected to interbeing. I love what you brought up before sitting. We are one with both the oppressed and the oppressor. And that oneness is a source of power, and possibility for change. Interbeing also teaches us how to practice nonviolent resistance, how to think through those particular sources of power that we have in order to create change. And also, it gives us hope for perseverance. It gives us hope that when we achieve change through nonviolence, that it will not just last a day, but that it will lead to transformative change over the long term as well. And so I want to close by reading a poem from Thich Nhat Hanh that is related to this, that really struck me as I was preparing for this. This is the poem Recommendation. Promise me this day. Promise me now, while the sun is overhead, exactly at the zenith. Promise me. Even as they strike you down with a mountain of hatred and violence, even as they step on you and crush you like a worm, even as they dismember and disembowel you, remember, brother, remember. Man is not our enemy. The only thing worthy of you is compassion, invincible, limitless, unconditional. Hatred will never let you face the beast in man. One day, when you face this beast alone, with your courage intact, your eyes kind, untroubled, even as no one sees them, out of your smile will bloom a flower, and those who love you will behold you across 10,000 worlds of birth and dying. Alone again, I will go on with bent head, knowing that love has become eternal. On the long, rough road, the sun and moon will continue to shine. Thank you. So I have 3 questions related to these 3 lessons for us to discuss, if that's all right. And I thought that we could, typically how I do something like this in the classroom is turn to a neighbor or a group of 2 or 3 people, chat about it for a second, and then discuss in the larger group as well. Does that work for everyone? Sound good? Okay. So my first question is inviting everyone to reflect on what are the structures of power with which you inter-are, and what kinds of power are you giving them in your daily life and practice. This could be material, this could be ideological, this could be in the things that you're willing to treat as normal or abnormal. So I encourage us to think expansively about this question, and maybe discuss with a neighbor for a little bit, and then we can talk as a group.
How are you? People like self-research because like we know there's certain ones like we don't cut anything in front of each other like lines, and a lot of time we just follow the walls without like being watched by police officers. So I feel like we create this power structure just based on a loose lattice work of what we're supposed to do, and we kind of fill in the rest when we feel like we have to do these things.
How I I feel like the way I about this. Yeah, I don't know how I was I don't know.
So that's why I said.
I've given so much power to my
In my opinion, it wasn't really confrontational, but I could see how it to provide more context, I told them I need to be honest, I put it in that and they just insisted on,
well,
yeah,
it's
first
just,
they were
be in the office.
which of course you know, when that's an hour after I told you I told you. So I was like, hey,
But it's something that's like,
they rescheduled it, instead of rescheduling it today or something like that, they rescheduled it to 5:30. Didn't tell me until board when I had another appointment, so like,
I feel like we're stuck
they
in
didn't
like
tell
this
me.
minimum wage
And then they
like
like
what
said
we're
it,
doing, we're doing jobs that we don't like.
it's only 30 minutes over, right?
And I don't feel like society eventually reaches
And
the
I was
issue
like,
where
no,
it's more like a
actually,
startup
that's
society where
you need to
there's
just
be money, there's people making
and
money, everything's
so 5:30
but I feel like we're so far away from that, but so most of us are just stuck
which
in
already upset me because you just
that's when we
wasted
get power because we have no choice.
time
What
and
do we do?
and I went to my room, I was packing up because I ended and they came to my room. And the doctor that
There are
was
strengths.
saying like, oh, like she was trying to say,
And that's a very common thing. I don't know if it's like.
it was like we're a different department, right? So it's not fair to me.
I know that everything's
Really
really
hard
hard
to
to
do,
do,
but
but
also
also very effective.
he didn't do his job, that's not my fault.
To be
I don't
balanced
know, I
between that and happiness.
Go talk to Johnny.
It's the balance
between how much time you give and time that we have.
Work together.
So this lady, you're trying to get me to get 30 minutes.
All right, maybe I will ask all of you to maybe take a minute to wrap up, and then we can discuss as the larger
Then through my work, I also power the power of my organization, department, school. They will be able to publish my work, and that gives them some power. So I don't 100% agree with what they do, but I don't know. I feel like there's often lacks a channel for us to unionize or to voice what is
Yeah, I mean, I still work
like,
there.
like our and I also pay like cash which empower the US government and which is very problematic at this moment, and I don't agree with how they spend money, but it doesn't seem that I have.
All right, and now I will ask everybody, I hear some really great discussions going on, and I'd love to hear some sharing with the group as a whole. What were what was coming up in your discussion? What are some of the power structures that you inter-are with, and what kinds of power are you giving them? So open it up to anyone who would like to share.
Leo bowing in. So to answer that question, the biggest thing that kind of welled within me, because I've been grasping this for several days now, is the power that we give our occupation. The power. I stole it from you. No. Just because I give so much time to my work, and I give so much power to the concept of money and the concept that I need to have stability. That's not to say that that's not like real in some form, but this talk is making me question kind of how much power I am giving to that, when maybe right now that energy can be directed towards better things. But of course, I am scared to, you know, not pay the bills and end up on the street.
Mhm.
So that's still there, but I really appreciate the reflection and thank you for this talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Drew bowing in. Kind of on the occupational topic, which it sounds like a lot of people have talked about. I'm an attorney for the federal government for a living, so you know, I'm not only a recipient of a lot of the decisions that power structures make, but I also enforce some of those decisions. And thankfully, I like my job. I do good work. I don't do anything that I have qualms about. But I know someday that may change because orders come down from above, and you know, it's my job as long as they're constitutional, which is a big if. You know, it's my job to do them. But at the same time, I know that I'm in a good position where I can say no. That is a form of nonviolent resistance, of being within a structure of power and not just doing what I'm told to do. And then one thing that we talked about was just how hard it is to feel like what you can do as just one person affects large structures like that. And being within the system, I can say that one person does make a difference. One person writing to a congressman, writing to a senator, writing to a head of a federal agency. You know, I hear from the head of our agency, and I'm a nobody. I really am. I'm way down on the totem pole, but when a squeaky wheel starts squeaking, you know, it comes to me. So things that people say, letters people write, phone calls they make, they're not going off into the ether. They're actually making a difference. So just as somebody who's within a structure, you know, I can say that raising your voice does make a difference. Drew bowing out.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to share? How much longer do we have for discussion?
About 15 minutes.
About 15 minutes? Okay, wonderful. Then I'll invite you to gather in smaller groups again and reflect on, you know, having thought through some of these structures in which we exist and the kinds of power that we are giving to them. What are creative forms of resistance, either individually or together with others, that would alter or change those flows of power? Okay, does that make sense? All right, and we'll take a few minutes to discuss that and then come back to the group as a whole.
But there is the we recently I'm not There's some of those, like, expected to whatever raise their degree, and they don't expect you to basically
At first,
and there's those complaints. Which is such a thing, because I want to do this. I don't want to room for disagreement.
So do you feel like the situation you're in is like,
And I think when one, I could do it, and also.
I wouldn't say that speaking or sharing with other people, probably I think it's best because if we listen to other people and share how we feel personally, and then we can get without do something.
A lot of, if you can make a good point while making people laugh and getting people to think certain things, might be the smartest person. You know, kind of like,
It's interesting because this is still.
I feel like what we should find out is a vote.
And I feel like a lot of
Like,
issues that I struggle with.
yeah, like brands that we don't like research, like directly, that are healthcare.
And I feel like there's a lot of
Actually, like,
people
support their employees.
like
When you see
for everything.
cast votes, like,
And there's a good happy medium there, but I don't see it.
yeah.
It's such a
Right.
Yeah.
I would say and you know, because it's true.
Yeah, it's almost like there's multiple narratives, you know,
But the employer and employee relationship I think there are statements that
because that's essentially what.
I've gotten more that way in recent years.
I feel like some employers that I talk to, like, get lots of children, that like everyone is replaceable, right? So I feel like that. I think there's that's but what they're leaving out is that convention individual is actually huge. And that any situation you would not want to have to see all. So if they're really trying to do that,
He didn't say to resist what, right? He said resist. Gotcha.
so that's anti-racist yourself. You do not get your act right. You're not gonna have because you're gonna be so busy fighting people and losing money on it. You're not gonna be able to. It's not the most notable management that I even had
Because we make up the lattice work of everything.
which is unheard of. Like normally it's just
Let's remember the question.
so they have, you know, teachers who were refusing to keep up with it. They had clients and students who don't want to share their
And
opinion.
ourselves are what's really first and foremost responsible for making ourselves feel not more than anybody else. So we start with who you are
There's something,
and how you
something's
behave.
gonna work when it's.
More so than trying to restrict somebody else or trying to convince them. We have to start with
Think about things.
I guess art's another extreme way to resist, like art that, I don't know, highlights issues with the power structure.
One thing that I've seen,
One thing
I feel like I'm very similar in this. I've seen people stay, but then have you heard the Nonviolence? Yeah, like I've seen
We might learn something about
I
ourselves
think that's pretty effective
through art.
I personally would rather like eyeball it halfway. So I want to be passionate for the right reasons. I don't want to have
Is there like a threshold that they enough people say
I suppose you don't like it very much.
these guys are like how, if there's a threshold, how do we ever get to the threshold? What is a small thing that threshold is never.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably the most honest answer is
See, that's a company I wouldn't expect to be
that's a
that
very unsatisfying answer. Well, there has been a fair amount of research looking at this. How large do nonviolent resistance campaigns have to be in order to achieve success? What portion of the population has to be motivated to, for instance, a campaign to overthrow a dictatorship? And it's actually quite low in percentage terms. One kind of common thing is that scholar is that the nonviolent resistance campaign that mobilized 3.5% of a country's population is succeed every time. Once you pass that, so in that case,
Lab experiment from historical data.
from historical data, yeah, exactly.
That'd be one way to go.
And this is not a magic number. It's not sort of once you pass that method, then it's based on observation as well. But I think what that indicates is that even sort of a social political system that's as big and complex as a national government dictatorship, even sort of a relatively small number of people actively refusing to participate in it can have essentially like catastrophic consequences for the functioning of that system. And so, I think oppressive systems, whether that be lawyers, whether that be political leaders, rely on keeping us separate from each other, rely on keeping us from talking to each other and engaging in collective action. Because once we engage in collective action, even in relatively small numbers, systems don't continue to function. So I would say that's the closest thing to a sort of numerical threshold that we sort of observe from the research. But it varies a lot. In some cases, a single individual placed in a particular social or political position with particular kinds of power can have a major impact. But often typically this is a collective enterprise that has to be done in coordination with others.
If unionizing is a way to create that, that's
They don't find the most effective strategic way
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the strategy is a big part of it. Something that I do a lot out of my outside of my academic research is working with activists to think about their work. Strategy is part of it. I think
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways.
something that Byron raised before, that I think a lot of people feel kind of paralyzed by, there are so many different things that I could be spending time on, so how do I choose what to mobilize around? Like, that's something that often paralyzes me as well. And I think it's also, it's costly to sustain over time. That if you think about something like, say, civil rights movement, a huge amount of what Dr. King was doing most of his time was fundraising, because he needed to, even keeping sort of a relatively small organization like the Southern Foundation going, required a huge amount of resources coming in academics, working full time in addition to also being engaged. And I think it's also, many movements also struggle with maintaining unity. And I think you could see this in, say, something like the Occupy Wall Street movement a few years ago, where the movement fragments around what it actually wants. People may have a shared sense of, we want less economic inequality, but people have very different visions of how we get there, and then that leads to infighting within movements. And so even when sort of the movement as a whole may share a larger objective, then their sort of effective pursuit of that objective breaks down because the movement fragments. Yes, I think for sake of time, where are we at? I think I'll ask people to share, and then we can. Thank you.
All right, everyone. So I will ask everyone maybe to share a little bit with the group as well. I got distracted by some really great questions from Angie that we were discussing. But yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the creative forms of resistance that people were thinking about in your discussions.
I was just talking about just being a vegetarian or being a vegan, which has been around for a long time. But I just when I'm around my family or friends, I just wish you all would really consider being at least a vegetarian, right? And then they're like, "Why are you?" And I said, "Because I don't believe in contributing to suffering in the world, right? It's not a dietary choice that I'm making, right, or a philosophical choice. I feel like that's a very powerful way of resistance in a culture that's really pushing eating meat and consuming animals and the corporate entity. So that's the one I can really think of. It's funny, other things, creative things, I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. As a fellow vegan, I appreciate you highlighting that.
I'm a vegetarian. I'm trying to be a vegan, but I have to work on my cheese situation. So.
Fair.
Right.
Leo Baumian. I'm just gonna say, if I ever decide fully I'm ready to quit this job, before I do, I'd like to talk to some people and be like,
before you're ready to what?
If I truly decide I can quit my job, before I do, I would like to talk to some people and maybe see if we can organize something. Leo Baumian. Was that too confusing?
I have a follow-up question. I'll ask you.
Bree's ready to start something with Leo.
I'm not sure I do, but I'm behind you.
Would anyone else like to share?
Something random I was thinking about after our group conversation. I didn't discuss it with the group, but a lot of what the food industry does bothers me, with the non-processed foods we push, how grocery stores are set up, and I think a very simple and powerful way of nonviolent resistance is I just don't buy those foods. And I encourage healthy eating, healthy living with others. And very small action, but hopefully it makes a difference.
I think, Angie Bonnie, I think our group also talked a lot about what we can do at work, and we sort of figured there's not really a lot we can do, but we think like getting connected with other people or sharing our own experience with other people, try to get connected is also a powerful way of resisting to the injustice, because if enough people reach the consensus, then there would be, that could lead to collective action.
Thank you.
Laura Galligan, just about work, the notion of right livelihood, which I don't like to think of it in two ways, right? There are things that professions that you're doing that are really contributing to the world, right? Whether it's music education for kids or all sorts of different things. But then there's also right livelihood, which is the right livelihood for you, of the person that you want, how you want to appear in the world. And I think, like, when you're thinking about making a choice or a decision, someone's really exploring those concepts. And if there is a path to go that can honor those for yourself and the world. It's two different aspects of our family.
Thank you. All right, well, I think we were at 7, so I think I'll hand things back over to you.
So let's do some announcements before we close. They're all on our website. I won't, I'll just run through them. A couple of bake sales coming up. Book club, Thursday, a day of mindfulness retreat, Saturday, May 24th. Rest and Renewed candlelight sound bath next Saturday. Next Sunday, mini Reiki sessions for mindfulness. Anything else, Jim?
So yes, those are all the events that community is building, and I wanted to thank everyone for building this community together. And as a center director, I've been honored to see every inch of this building, every structure of this organization is built with love and creative force of the community members. So thank you for being part of this experiment of making this, what Anna calls it, our social media director, brave space. We have been being great and generous space, being a generous space, inclusive space, but now we are trying to make this space braver. So thank you for participating in this wonderful conversation, brave, compassionate, and creative. And my